There are cases I think about when the courthouse is empty and the only sound is the clock on the wall measuring out the silence. This is one of them. A man came into my courtroom on a cold November morning wearing the best shirt he owned. It was white, ironed. The collar was frayed at the edges in the way that no amount of care can fix, only replace. And he couldn't replace it. That much was obvious before he ever opened his mouth. The charge was negligent operation of a motor vehicle, collision with public property, $4,200 in damages. On paper, it was routine, the kind of case that gets processed and filed and forgotten before lunch. But there was one line in the report that I kept coming back to. He had been found unconscious at the wheel. Toxicology came back completely clean, which meant his body had simply stopped, decided without his permission that it had nothing left to give, and he had no idea it was going to do that. He thought he was fine. He thought he could make it home. What I didn't know yet, what the file didn't tell me, what no file ever tells you, was why he was behind that wheel at 6:50 in the morning in that condition. What he had been doing for the 72 hours before that moment. What he had been carrying for months before that. When I finally asked him, the room went absolutely still. What he said next didn't just change my verdict. It changed the way I understood what it means to love someone quietly, without asking for anything back, until there is nothing left of you to give. Before I tell you what he said, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If stories about justice, hidden truths, and the people this world overlooks move something in you, you're exactly where you need to be. There are mornings in this courthouse that feel less like justice and more like gravity. An invisible force pressing down on everyone who walks through those doors, defendants and judges alike, as if the building itself understands the weight of what happens inside it. I have sat on this bench for 31 years. I have watched men in expensive suits lie without blinking, and I have watched men in worn shoes tell the truth so raw and unpolished it almost hurt to receive it. After 3 decades, you learn something the law schools never teach you. The most dangerous thing a courtroom can do is forget that every case file contains a human being. That November morning was the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't bite. It simply settles into your joints and stays there, quiet and permanent, like old grief. The radiator in courtroom 4 had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. Someone had submitted a maintenance request, I was told, and it was being processed. In the meantime, we wore our coats a little longer and pretended not to notice. The fluorescent light above the witness stand flickered every 40 seconds. I had started counting, involuntarily, the way you count anything that repeats when a room is too quiet. There was a smell that morning, old coffee, damp paper, the particular musk of a public building that has absorbed 30 years of human anxiety into its walls. My clerk, Patricia, had set a cup on the edge of my desk, black, no sugar, the way I've taken it since 1987. I hadn't touched it. I was reading. His name appeared on the 3rd line of the docket. Raymond Kowalski, 52 years old, no prior record. Address, 412 Sutter Lane, apartment 7B. The file was thin. A thin file, in my experience, means one of 2 things. Either nothing has happened to this person, or everything has happened to this person, and none of it was ever written down. I heard the door at the back of the courtroom open. I didn't look up immediately. I've learned not to. There is something you can read in a room before you read the person. The way the air shifts, the quality of the footsteps, whether they're the steps of someone who belongs in authority or someone who has spent a lifetime trying not to take up too much space. These steps were careful, measured. The steps of a man who had spent years walking hospital corridors at 3 in the morning, making himself invisible so the sleeping patients wouldn't be disturbed. I looked up. He was not what I expected, though after 31 years I have learned to be suspicious of my own expectations. He was a medium-built man with the kind of posture that comes not from laziness, but from carrying something heavy for too long. Shoulders that had learned to round inward, not from defeat, but from the physical memory of pushing mop carts, of leaning into the work. His hands were at his sides, and even from the bench I could see them. Large hands, the knuckles slightly swollen, the skin around the fingers pale in patches where the bleach had worked its way in and never fully left. His shirt was white, careful. Someone had ironed it with intention, the kind of ironing that says, "This is the best I have, and I want you to know I tried." The collar was frayed in the way that expensive dry cleaning cannot fix, only replace. His trousers were black and slightly short at the ankle. His shoes were brown, old, but polished to a shine that caught even the weak November light filtering through the courtroom's high windows. He looked at me once, briefly, the way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to look at, and then his eyes dropped to the floor in front of him. He sat down at the defendant's table. He folded his hands in his lap, and he waited, with the particular patience of a man who has spent his life waiting for systems larger than himself to decide things about him. In the first row of the public gallery, a woman in a beige coat sat rigid, her handbag pressed against her stomach with both hands like a shield. Next to her, a young man in a community college sweatshirt, 19, maybe 20, was staring at the back of the man's head with an expression I recognized immediately. I've seen it on my own face in old photographs, at my father's funeral. It is the expression of someone who is only just beginning to understand the cost of something they were given. I adjusted my glasses. I looked at the file again. Then I looked at Raymond Kowalski. The light above the witness stand flickered. I picked up my pen. The prosecutor's name was Gerald Fitch. He was 34 years old, ambitious in the particular way that young prosecutors sometimes are. Not cruel exactly, but unfinished. He had not yet accumulated enough life to know the difference between a case and a person. He would, eventually. They all do, if they stay long enough. But that morning, Gerald Fitch stood at his table with his folder open and his posture straight, and he read the charges with the flat efficiency of a man reciting a grocery list. Negligent operation of a motor vehicle, collision with public property, estimated damages, $4,200, failure to maintain control of the vehicle. The words landed in the room the way stones land in still water, each one creating a ripple. I watched Raymond Kowalski's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly as each charge was read. Not in anger, in the particular way a person tightens when they are hearing something true described in a language that makes it sound like something else entirely. Fitch continued. He noted that the vehicle had mounted a curb at approximately 6:51 in the morning on the 14th of November, colliding with a utility pole on the corner of Merchant Street and Delray Avenue. He noted that no other vehicles were involved. He noted that responding officers had found the defendant unresponsive at the wheel and had initially suspected alcohol or controlled substances. Toxicology, he conceded, had returned completely clean. He said the word clean the way you might say it about a surprise, as if sobriety in this circumstance required explanation. He noted finally that the defendant had been cited previously for a broken taillight 18 months prior, as though this were relevant. It was not relevant, but it was in the file, and Gerald Fitch was the kind of man who used everything in the file. I let him finish. I always let them finish. Then I looked at Raymond Kowalski's attorney, a public defender named Sheila Marsh, who was simultaneously excellent at her job and catastrophically overworked, as all public defenders are. She had the look of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and professional obligation, which, I would later come to understand, gave her something particular in common with her client. She made her counter-arguments efficiently and without flourish. No prior criminal record, no intent, no injury to any person, no history of reckless behavior. She noted the clean toxicology. She noted the lack of any victims. She asked for the charges to be reduced and the financial penalty to be waived, given her client's economic circumstances. Fitch objected. Public property had been damaged. Accountability, he said, was not optional. I have heard that word, accountability, used more times in this courtroom than I can count. It is a good word. It is also, like most good words, capable of being wielded poorly. Accountability for what? I always want to ask. Accountability to whom? At what cost? And measured against what understanding of how the damage came to happen in the first place? I said none of this to Fitch. I simply looked at him until he sat down. The room settled back into its silence. The radiator clicked once, as if considering whether to offer heat, then thought better of it. Someone in the gallery coughed softly. The fluorescent light above the witness stand flickered. 17, 18, 19 seconds, and then the flicker. I looked at the damage estimate again. $4,200. I looked at the address on the file. Apartment 7B. I looked at the man sitting at the defendant's table, his ironed collar, his polished brown shoes, his hands folded in his lap with the stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the safest thing to offer a world that doesn't always make room for you. I thought about my father. He worked in a manufacturing plant for 26 years. He came home every night with the particular exhaustion that manual labor produces, not just in the muscles, but deeper, in the place where a person stores their sense of themselves. He never complained. I don't remember him ever once sitting down at the dinner table and saying, "I am tired." I remember him sitting down and asking about my homework, asking about my day, pouring his energy, what remained of it, into the future that sat across the table from him eating pot roast. He died at 58. His heart, the doctor said. I have always believed it was something more complicated than that. I set the file down. I clasped my hands on the bench in front of me and I looked at Raymond Kowalski for a long moment. He was looking at the table. Then, as if he felt the weight of my attention, he looked up. His eyes were dark brown and very tired. Not the tiredness of a morning or even a week, but the deep, sedimentary tiredness of months, layered and compressed into something that had permanently altered the landscape of his face. I leaned forward slightly. The room, without being told to, went completely quiet. "Mr. Kowalski," I said, "before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time before you answer." He nodded once, barely, the nod of a man bracing himself. "The report says you were found unresponsive at the wheel. Toxicology was clean, which means your body made a decision your mind didn't authorize." I paused. Let that sit. "So I need you to tell me something the file doesn't." The fluorescent light flickered. "Why were you behind that wheel at 6:50 in the morning in that condition?" The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel it. Gerald Fitch shifted in his chair. Sheila Marsh was very still. In the gallery, the woman in the beige coat had stopped breathing, or seemed to have. Raymond Kowalski looked at me, and something in his face, some last carefully maintained wall, began slowly to come down. He didn't speak immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people, when asked a direct question in this courtroom, rush to fill the silence, with explanations, with apologies, with the particular verbal scrambling of someone who believes that silence itself is incriminating. Raymond Kowalski did not rush. He sat with the question for a moment the way you sit with something heavy before you decide how to lift it. Then he straightened, just slightly, an almost invisible adjustment of the spine, as if somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the frayed collar and the polished shoes, something old and dignified was reminding him how to stand up inside himself. "I work at St. Anne's Hospital," he said. "Sanitation department, 14 years. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had learned to speak quietly in places where people were sleeping or healing or dying, and had never quite unlearned it. "I do the overnight shifts mostly, the ones nobody wants. The ICU corridors, the emergency bathrooms, the trauma bays after—" He stopped, chose his words. "After they're done being used." I said nothing. I have learned that silence, offered at the right moment, is the most powerful question in any courtroom. "My wife lost her job in March," he continued, 8 months ago. "She's been doing alterations at home, taking in sewing, whatever she can find, but it's not—" He paused again. "It's not enough. The rent went up in August. The car needs a timing belt. And my son—" His voice changed on that word. "Son." the way a voice changes when it arrives at the thing it's been circling all along. My son Marcus got accepted to Riverside Community College in September. First one in our family, ever. In the gallery, I heard a sound, very small, the sound of someone pressing their lips together very hard to keep something in. I couldn't. Ray stopped, pressed his thumb against the inside of his opposite palm, a private gesture, something he probably did when he was alone. I couldn't let that not happen, you understand? That couldn't be the thing that didn't happen because we ran out of money. So I started picking up extra shifts, one more a week, then two, then whatever they'd give me. He looked at his hands. The week of the 14th, I'd done 3 doubles, back to back. I finished my 3rd shift at 6:47 that morning. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes because I could feel, I don't know how to explain it. I could feel that I was very far from the surface of myself, like I was looking at my own hands from a distance. He paused. But I had to get home. Donna, my wife, she worries. I didn't want her to worry. He looked up at me. I remember pulling out of the hospital parking lot. I remember the traffic light at the corner of 5th and Merchant. It was green. And then I remember nothing, until there were lights behind me, red and blue, and someone was knocking on my window. The room was absolutely still. I looked at him for a long time. I looked at the file. I looked at Gerald Fitch, who was no longer sitting with the posture of a man about to make an argument. I looked at the young man in the gallery in the community college sweatshirt, who was looking at his father with an expression that would take him years to fully decode. The specific, shattering realization of what a parent has quietly absorbed on your behalf, without a word, without a complaint, without ever once asking you to know about it. I took my glasses off. I am not ashamed to say that I needed a moment. I thought about my father's hands at the dinner table, the way they looked after a 12-hour shift, not just tired, but used, thoroughly, completely used, in the service of something he loved more than his own comfort. I thought about the last time I saw him standing. He was at my law school graduation. He wore a suit he'd had since 1974. He'd had it pressed at the dry cleaner on Maplewood Avenue, and he stood in the September sun outside the auditorium and he shook my hand, shook it formally, as if I had become someone he wanted to show respect to. And he said, "I always knew you'd get here, son." He was dead 14 months later. I put my glasses back on. I folded my hands. And I spoke, not from the bench exactly, but from somewhere older and quieter than the bench. Mr. Kowalski, in 31 years on this seat, I have heard a great many explanations for a great many things. I have heard lies constructed with remarkable architecture. I have heard truths that were uglier than any lie. And I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, but I have learned, to hear the difference. I paused. What you have just described to me is not negligence. Negligence implies indifference. What you have described is the opposite of indifference. You were behind that wheel at 6:50 in the morning, in that condition, because you refused to stop caring for the people who depend on you, even when your own body had reached its absolute limit. Fitch shifted. I looked at him briefly, not unkindly, but with enough steadiness that he settled. The law asked me to evaluate what you did, I continued. I am also permitted to evaluate why. And I am required, not by statute, but by the most basic obligation of this office, to ensure that what I call justice actually resembles it. I looked at the damage estimate one final time. $4,200. I thought about what $4,200 means to a man in apartment 7B, whose wife is taking in sewing, and whose son just started college. I thought about the utility pole, standing intact on the corner of Merchant and Delray, doing its job, entirely unaware of the conversation happening in its name. I picked up my gavel. The charge of negligent operation is hereby dismissed. The financial liability for damages to public property is reclassified under force majeure, an involuntary medical episode beyond the defendant's reasonable control, and is waived in full. I heard the woman in the beige coat make a sound, a short, compressed sound, the kind that escapes before you can stop it. Furthermore, I said, and I looked directly at Raymond Kowalski, who was sitting very still in the way that people sit when they are afraid that moving will somehow undo something fragile. This court issues a formal letter of commendation to be placed in the record, acknowledging 14 years of continuous service to St. Anne's Hospital without a single disciplinary incident. That letter will be signed by me personally. I paused one final time. And Mr. Kowalski, my voice, I noticed, had dropped to something almost conversational. Something between two people, rather than between an institution and a citizen. Go home. Sleep. Whatever shift you were planning to pick up this weekend, don't. You have already given more than enough. It is not weakness to let your body rest. It is, in fact, the only way to make sure you're still standing when that boy walks across his graduation stage. Raymond Kowalski looked at me. His face did not collapse dramatically. It did not crumple the way faces do in films. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. Something behind his eyes simply released. Like a breath held for so long the body had forgotten it was holding it. His shoulders dropped half an inch, and he nodded, slowly, deeply, the way you nod not to agree with something but to receive it. I brought the gavel down. The sound of it filled the room, and then the room was quiet. And in that quiet, somewhere behind me, I could hear the radiator finally, tentatively, begin to offer a little warmth. I have a habit after a long day on the bench of sitting in my chambers for a while before I go home. Not reviewing files, not preparing for the next morning's docket, just sitting. My wife used to tease me about it. She'd say I was communing with the furniture, which was not entirely inaccurate. There is something in the particular silence of an empty courthouse after hours that I have never found anywhere else. The building exhales. All that compressed human urgency, the fear, the hope, the grinding procedural machinery of justice, settles into the walls, and for a little while the place simply breathes. That November evening I sat in my chair and I looked at the framed photograph I keep on the corner of my desk. My father, 1974, standing outside the plant in his work clothes. He is squinting slightly against the sun, and he is almost smiling. The particular almost smile of a man who is happy but has learned to hold happiness carefully, in case it needs to be rationed. I have looked at that photograph nearly every working day for 20 years. That evening, for the first time in a long time, I looked at it and felt something other than loss. I felt unexpectedly and quietly something like gratitude. Raymond Kowalski walked out of courtroom 4 that morning with no fine, no record, and a letter signed by a federal judge folded in the breast pocket of his ironed white shirt. I know this because Patricia told me she watched him stop just outside the courtroom doors, take the envelope out, look at it for a moment, and then press it carefully against his chest with one large, bleach-marked hand before putting it back. I know what happened afterward because these things have a way of finding their way back to me. The law is a small world dressed up in large buildings. The letter was delivered to St. Anne's Hospital administration the following week by Sheila Marsh, Raymond's public defender, who submitted it alongside a formal complaint regarding the hospital's overtime scheduling practices. The complaint cited a pattern of sanitation staff regularly working shifts in excess of what occupational health guidelines recommend, sometimes double, sometimes triple coverage absorbed by a small rotating group of employees who could not afford to say no and whose supervisors had learned not to ask. The hospital's legal department, I am told, read the complaint on a Monday morning. By Thursday of that same week, a new internal policy had been drafted limiting consecutive shift hours for all non-medical support staff and establishing a voluntary overtime cap with opt-out protections. It was not a perfect policy. Policies rarely are, but it existed where nothing had existed before. And sometimes that is the beginning of something real. I did not orchestrate any of this. I want to be clear about that. A judge's authority ends at the gavel. What happens beyond those courtroom doors is the business of living people making living decisions in a world the law can shape, but never fully contain. I simply told the truth about what I saw in that room, and the truth, on that occasion, turned out to have somewhere to go. Marcus Kowalski graduated from Riverside Community College 22 months later with an associate degree in healthcare administration. Sheila Marsh sent me a photograph. She does that sometimes with the cases that resolve in ways worth remembering. In the photograph, Marcus is in his graduation gown, holding his diploma with both hands, grinning with the complete and uncomplicated joy of someone who has not yet learned to hold happiness carefully. He has not yet needed to learn that. That is the whole point. Standing next to him, slightly to the left, is Raymond Kowalski. He is wearing the same suit he wore to court. I recognized it immediately, the slightly short trousers, the polished brown shoes. But his shoulders are different. They are not rounded inward. They are back. Not puffed with pride, not performative in any way, simply back, in the way that a person stands when they are no longer carrying something alone. He is looking at his son. He is almost smiling. I kept that photograph. It is on my desk now, to the right of the one of my father. Two men separated by 50 years, connected by the same quiet stubbornness. The refusal to let the people they love run out of future. I think about Raymond Kowalski on mornings when the docket is long and the cases are hard, and the machinery of this institution feels heavier than usual. I think about him when a file comes across my bench and I catch myself reading the charges before I've read the name. I think about what it cost him to sit in that chair and tell the truth about his exhaustion in a room full of strangers, with no guarantee that the truth would be received as anything other than an excuse. It takes a particular kind of courage to be vulnerable inside a system designed to evaluate and categorize and assign liability. Most people in that chair are braced for judgment. Raymond Kowalski sat down, folded his hands in his lap, and told me the truth anyway. That is not nothing. In my experience, it is very close to everything. 31 years on this bench have taught me many things, but the most important is perhaps the simplest. Justice is not a formula. It is not the automatic product of charges read and penalties assigned and gavels brought down in correct procedural sequence. Justice is an act of attention. It requires someone in the room to slow down long enough to ask not only what happened, but why, and to be willing to let the answer change the shape of the response. Raymond Kowalski did not come into my courtroom looking to be saved. He came in prepared to absorb whatever the system decided to hand him, the way he had absorbed everything else, quietly, with his hands folded, taking up as little space as possible. He had spent his whole life making himself small so that the people he loved could be large. It was the least I could do to make sure, on that one November morning, the room was big enough to finally see him. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize someone in Raymond, or in that young man in the graduation photograph, or even in an old judge sitting alone in his chambers looking at pictures of his father, then you already understand why these cases matter. Not because they are dramatic, because they are true, in the way that the most important things are true, not in their facts, but in what they reveal about who we are to each other when the systems fall away, and it is just one human being looking at another across a very small room. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment with the name of someone who works without being seen, a janitor, a night shift nurse, a driver, a cook. Say their name in the comments below, because sometimes the most radical thing justice can do is simply notice that someone was there. I'll see you in the next case. If this story stayed with you, take just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Is there someone in your life who has been quietly exhausting themselves for you, working in the background, saying nothing, asking for nothing, and you haven't yet found the words to tell them that you see it, that you know what it cost? And have you ever sat in a chair, not in a courtroom, but somewhere, waiting for a system or a person, or just life itself to decide something about you, carrying a truth inside you that no one had thought to ask about yet? Raymond Kowalski didn't need someone to save him. He needed someone to slow down long enough to ask the right question. That's all. Sometimes that is everything. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, invisible sacrifice, and the kind of justice that looks a person in the eye before it reaches for the gavel, make sure you're subscribed. There are more people in these files worth knowing about. I'll see you in the next case.